The small town of Elmswood was no stranger to harsh winters. Snow draped over rooftops, and the streets glistened under the pale moonlight. But on the edge of town, secluded behind frost coated pines, stood an old Victorian mansion known as Briarwood Hall. It was said that no one who entered Briarwood Hall during winter ever came out unchanged. The house loomed like a ghost against the white backdrop, its once grand facade now weathered and cracked. Icicles hung like jagged teeth from its eaves, and a chilling wind howled through its broken windows, sounding like anguished cries. Locals swore they could see faint candlelight flickering in the upstairs window at night, even though the house had been abandoned for decades. One frigid evening, Eliza Hart, a journalist for a small paranormal magazine, arrived in town. She was eager to debunk the rumors surrounding the house, believing them to be little more than local folklore. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a thermal blanket, she trudged through knee-deep snow toward the foreboding mansion. As she stepped inside, the air turned unnaturally cold, colder than the snowstorm outside. Her breath crystallized in front of her as she scanned the grand foyer. Dust-covered chandeliers hung precariously, and faded wallpaper peeled from the walls. The house smelled of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Eliza's footsteps echoed as she ventured deeper. She paused in the parlor, where a grand piano sat untouched. To her surprise, its keys were clean, free of the dust that covered everything else. Suddenly, a single note rang out, a deep, mournful tone that made her spine stiffen. She whipped around, but no one was there. "Just the wind," she muttered. The temperature dropped further as she ascended the grand staircase, her flashlight flickering. The upstairs hall was lined with closed doors. As she passed one, a child's voice giggled faintly behind it. Eliza froze. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible over her pounding heart. The door creaked, opened slightly, revealing a dark room filled with antique toys, a rocking horse, a porcelain doll with hollow eyes, and a miniature train set that suddenly started moving on its own. Panicking, Eliza turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind her. The doll's head turned toward her, and a chilling voice whispered, "Why did you come here?" Eliza screamed, yanking the door open and bolting down the hall, but the house seemed to shift around her. The grand staircase was gone, replaced by a narrow, spiraling one leading downward. Desperate, she descended, the cold gnawing at her bones. She emerged in a vast basement filled with mirrors, each reflecting a different version of herself, some terrified, some frozen in mid-scream, and others standing eerily still, their eyes blackened. In the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. It held an old silver pocket watch, which ticked louder with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, its voice resonating as if spoken by many. "Winter here doesn't end." Eliza stumbled backward, but the mirror shattered, and the shards flew toward her. She shielded her face, but when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the basement. She was outside, lying in the snow, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. Briarwood Hall was gone, replaced by an empty, snow-covered field. When she returned to town, the locals stared at her in shock. Her hair had turned completely white, and her camera contained no evidence of her visit, except for one photograph of a single, frost-covered pocket watch. No one ever ventured to Briarwood Hall again, not even Eliza, for she knew one truth. Winter at the mansion wasn't just a season, it was a trap, waiting to claim its next victim. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, thick and relentless, burying the forest trail under a blanket of white. Aaron cursed under his breath as he trudged through the snow, his breath fogging the air. He had planned a solo winter hike to clear his mind after a rough year. But now he was lost. His phone had no signal, and the map he'd brought was useless under the unrelenting snowfall. Just as the cold began to bite at his resolve, he saw it, a small wooden cabin nestled among the pines. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, promising warmth. The cabin was old, with a sagging roof and frost-covered windows, but it was shelter. Aaron knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Pushing it open, he stepped inside. The air was stale, but warm, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace, though no one was in sight. "Hello?" he called, but only the wind outside responded. Grateful for the fire, he set his pack down and examined the single-room cabin. A table and 2 chairs sat near the fireplace. An old iron stove rested against the wall, and a narrow bed with a threadbare quilt occupied the far corner. Oddly, there were no personal belongings, no coats, boots, or even utensils. Shrugging off the unease creeping up in his spine, Aaron decided to wait out the storm. He dried his clothes by the fire and eventually crawled into bed, exhaustion overtaking him. Aaron woke to the sound of whispers. He sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, indistinct but insistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Aaron swung his legs out of bed and grabbed his flashlight. Its beam cut through the dark as he swept it across the room. Everything was as it had been, except for the frost creeping along the windows, forming intricate patterns like skeletal fingers. And then he saw it. A figure stood just outside the window, barely visible through the frost. Its face was obscured by a tangle of hair and shadow, but its eyes, black and hollow, locked onto Aaron's. It didn't move, didn't blink. Panicked, Aaron scrambled backward, knocking over a chair. When he looked again, the figure was gone, but the frost on the window had thickened, spelling out a single word: leave. Aaron didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pack and threw open the door, only to be met with an impenetrable wall of snow. The storm had worsened, and the path back was invisible. Desperation clawed at him as he turned back to the cabin. The fire was out, and the temperature had plummeted. His breath clouded in icy air. The whispers returned, louder this time, and the cabin seemed to shift around him. The walls creaked, and shadows danced in the corners, stretching unnaturally long. He clutched his flashlight, spinning in place as the voices grew into a cacophony. "Leave!" they screamed, overlapping and echoing. Suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own. The frost in the windows now covered the entire glass, darkening the room. Aaron's flashlight flickered, then died, leaving him in darkness. And then he heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps approaching from behind. Aaron was found 3 days later by a search party. He was huddled in the snow, frostbitten and incoherent. He kept muttering about the cabin and how they wouldn't let him leave. But when the rescuers followed his tracks, there was no cabin, just an empty clearing surrounded by frost-covered trees. Some say the cabin appears only during the coldest winters, luring in lost souls. Others whisper that it's cursed, a trap set by the spirits of those who froze to death in the woods long ago. But one thing is certain, If you find yourself lost in Black Hollow during a storm, don't seek shelter, because the cabin will find you first.